Okay, good morning. Okay. And welcome to the second day of this very interesting and thought-provoking conference. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker. Professor Susan Golden Meadow is a professor of psychology and human development at the University of Chicago. Her work on home sign, the communication of small deaf children in hearing families who have no language model, is widely known. This work led to Professor Golden Meadow's research on gestures that accompany speech and how gestures help us think. Okay, you're welcome to start.
Thank you very much. Okay, can you hear me? I think you can. I can hear myself too. Well, okay. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers for a wonderful day of talks yesterday, and I'm looking forward to today as well. I'll be happier when this one's over. I also want to say that many of the themes that Wendy Sandler introduced yesterday, I'm going to try to sort of reverberate today. So I'll try to pick them up and point them out as they come through. So I want to begin by going back to 1866, when the Linguistic Society of Paris banned all discussion of the evolution of language. What they said was that the society does not accept papers on either the origin of language or the invention of a universal language. And they did so because they thought no progress had been made on this topic and no progress was likely to be made. The London Philological Society followed suit in 1872. So now, 150 years later, I have a study that might make them change their minds. Now, I say might, because the language I'm talking about not only isn't French, and for Paris that matters, but it isn't even spoken. So before I talk about my own study, I want to go back to the literature, this is probably the first study that was reported on the resilience of language in 429 BC by Herodotus. And Herodotus tells us about an argument between an Egyptian and a Phrygian king. And they were arguing over which was the original language. Now, being kings, the only languages they considered were Phrygian and Egyptian. Somewhat uncharacteristically for kings, however, rather than deciding this question by battle, they decided it by experiment. So what they did is they took two very young children and put them in the care and custody of a shepherd, sent the shepherd out into the wild, where no sound would be heard. They told the shepherd to care for the kids, feed them, love them, all that stuff, but never to talk to them. They came back, 18 months later to see the progress on their study and found that both of the children produced the word bekos, which means bread in Phrygian. And so there the matter has rested for many, many years. Now, even before the IRB got serious about how we do our studies, this study was not easy to replicate. But we can actually take advantage of an experiment of nature. We can't ask parents to not talk to their kids or not give their kids input, but there are children who actually, by circumstance, are deprived of linguistic input. And the question then is, can such a child reinvent language? So the big first question is, who isn't exposed to linguistic input? Everybody's exposed to linguistic input. Well, it turns out there are some children who aren't. There are children whose hearing losses prevent them from learning a spoken language, so their children are profoundly deaf. And in addition, they're born to hearing parents. Their hearing parents don't know a sign language and haven't put them in a situation where they'd be exposed to a sign language. So they can't make use of spoken input, and they're not getting signed input. So for all intents and purposes, these children are lacking input from a conventional language model. So what do the children do? They actually turn to gesture to communicate. These gestures are called home signs. So let me give you an example of what a home sign looks like. This is the home signer, deaf child born to hearing parents in the United States. He's sitting in front of a picture book, a Richard Scarry picture book, for those of you who know the literature. And he's looking at a picture of a shovel stuck in sand. It's a sand shovel. But what he does is he starts to tell us a little story about snow shovels. And he tells you how the shovel is oh, we're not interpreted. Okay. Just noticed for the first time how the shovels are used and how it's kept outside and kept downstairs but used outside when the boots are put on. And he goes and tells us a whole little story about shovels. So here we go.
Shovel.
Can we make it a little louder?
No, when
what are you
Shovel
doing?
in winter time. Yeah, yes.
Outside?
And it's snowing.
Oh, and it's
It's
snowing.
snowing.
You got a shovel.
Snowing, yeah.
Right. Oh, I see. Where's the shovel?
Where is it? It's in the garage.
There it
In
is.
there.
Downstairs. Oh, there's the shovel. Oh, Dave.
So home signers are not unique to the United States. This is a deaf child of hearing parents in Taiwan. She's looking at the same book, but she's picked out a different picture to talk about. It's a picture of a swordfish. He's actually a pretty friendly swordfish, but she says something sort of horrific about him. What she says is that the swordfish can pierce you through the heart, and when it does that, it makes you dead. This is an emblem that hearing people in Taiwan use. It's not a sign. It's not from Taiwanese Sign Language. It's from what hearing people use. It's a little like a thumbs up or an okay. So it can pierce you through the heart and make you dead. It has a long nose and it swims. And her hearing sister then comes in front of her and she says, you know, using this language with her sister, she says it can pierce you through the heart and make you dead. Okay, friendly.
死掉啦！真的啊？死掉啊？哦，真的啊。鱼刺。他说的是一个大的，不晓得什么鱼。这个。他说他鼻子尖尖的，妈妈死掉了，已经。
Right, she actually pierces her sister's heart a little harder than she needed to symbolically represent piercing through the heart, nonetheless. Okay, so it's very clear that these two children are communicating. But what's of interest to me and to my colleagues is whether this communication is characterized by properties of language. And it turns out it is. And we've spent a lot of years trying to identify what those properties are, because these are the properties of language that a child can introduce into language without having seen or experienced conventional linguistic input. So I've listed here properties at the sentence level, at the word level, and properties in terms of language use. And I'm going to give you one example of each just to illustrate what home signers do. So the sentences that home signers create actually are structured. They're ordered. So here's an example of the child inviting me to have a snack, and what he does is he points at the grape, he does an eat gesture, and then he points at me. He does object, action, agent, which, as you'll recognize, is not English. In English, we would say, you eat the grape, not the grape eats you. And what's interesting about this child is that he always, or tends to almost always, put the objects in front of actions and put agents after actions, which is a structured order. In terms of words, what you see on the left here is a child, the same child using an eat gesture. Here he's dropped the horn and he now does eat. Now in China, they also use this eat gesture, but they do something a little bit more characteristic to China, which is this, okay, representing the chopsticks. Okay. And finally, in terms of language use, home signers will use these gestures to talk to themselves, which is pretty amazing. So this is an example of a child sitting next to his hearing sister. He's playing with clay, and he's looking for a plastic knife to cut the clay. And what he does is he gets up, and he looks around. He doesn't make eye contact with anybody. But what he does a flip gesture, a where gesture, where is it? And then he points to himself. But he's not doing what I'm doing, which is making eye contact with all of you. He's just looking around. This is really communication to himself. Okay, so he's getting up. He does his flip gesture, points at himself, is looking around, and he doesn't want help from anybody. This is really talk to himself. Okay, so one of the questions that may be bothering you, it bothered us, was whether these linguistic properties are invented by the children themselves or invented perhaps by their hearing parents. Because, of course, hearing parents gesture, as we all gesture when they talk. Perhaps they invented these linguistic properties and the kids just copied them. So we explored this question with respect to, I'm going to tell you about one structural property that we've looked at in Nicaraguan home sign. Okay. So here's a Nicaraguan home signer producing what we've called a complex noun phrase. And what he does is he does a sign for airplane, and then he points at himself, and then points over there. So airplane, mine over there. Airplane, mine over there. And we've we've given this, it's a simple structure, but it's a structure nonetheless, where airplane and mine is sort of embedded underneath the larger node. Okay. So we looked at the gestures that the hearing parents produce when they're interacting with these kids, and we used precisely the same tools that we use to identify what's in the deaf children's gestures to describe what the hearing parents do. And then we compared these gestures of kid and parent. We did it in both the United States and Nicaragua. This is complex noun phrases. Home signers are in red, hearing families are in blue, Nicaragua's on the left, United States is on the right. And what you see is that the red is bigger than the blue, so the home signers do more of these things than their hearing family members do. Strikingly, in the United States, the parents don't do any. They never do this. They're gesturing, but they never produce complex noun phrases. Now, but there is a fair amount of variability, and so what we tried to do was to look to see whether you might expect that parents who do a lot of these things will have kids who do a lot of these things, and parents who do very few will have kids who do very few. So you'll see a nice, neat, linear relationship between kid and parent. We looked at that and, in fact, found no relation between individual home signers' gestures and their hearing family members. So you see hearing family members on the x-axis, home signers on the y-axis. Not a surprise for the American parents, they're always at 0. But even for the Nicaraguan parents, the parent who produces the most number of these things has a kid who produces none of them. So it turns out there's really no correlation, 0.03, between what the parents are doing and what the children are doing, which suggests that the home signers are really inventing these rudiments of language. But of course, they're not inventing all of language. They're only going so far. And so one question is, how far can a home signer go toward inventing a full-fledged language? And this is a question that Wendy asked yesterday about the language she studies, ABSL. We've started to ask this question with respect to Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is another sign language growing up as we speak. Home signers, which I've portrayed over there, are unique in that they are deaf individuals in a sea of hearing people. And I've sort of expressed this by having them exist in their own little egg. What's interesting about them from my point of view is that they produce home sign, but what they get back is co-speech gesture. They get back what we produce all the time. They're surrounded by hearing people. So they are producers of this system, but they never see it. They never receive it. 30 to 40 years ago, home signers in Nicaragua were brought together for the very first time. Deaf people were brought together for the first time in an educational setting. Now, it turned out in this educational setting, the children learned nothing because they were teaching them Spanish and they couldn't understand the Spanish, but it gave them the opportunity to interact. And so for the first time, the home signers not only were producing home sign, but they were seeing other people produce home sign. So they were both producers of the system and receivers of the system, which I've sort of represented by having an egg around all of them. They're creating this together. And recently what's happening is that new deaf children are coming into this situation and they're learning the system from cohort 1. Okay, so in fact what we have here is a system of solo creators, which are home signs. They're doing it on their own, really, with very little help. They at least don't receive the system. Collaborative creators and learners. The last group really are learners. Okay, so what we've done is we've tried to look at very different properties of language to see which properties are produced by home signers, cohort 1 and cohort 2. And then what we've looked at recently is how to indicate more than one. So if I asked you to indicate more than one cup with gesture, what you might do is something like what this kid is doing. He does bunk, bunk, bunk. And in fact, there are 3 cups, bunk, bunk, bunk. Okay. But there's another way of doing it, and that is to indicate more than one with sort of this flowy gesture, which indicates a bunch. He can do this gesture for 3 things, for 10 things, for 2 things. It really means a bunch, more than one. It's more like a plural marker than indicating the exact number. Okay, so one question is, when do they use these 2 different ways of indicating more than one? So we gave these vignettes where a person comes down and his hand puts down the pens to people in each of the different groups, and we asked them to represent it. And what we found is that, first of all, home signers always use the discrete form, and they never use this more plural form to represent more than one in an agent context. And interestingly, cohort 1 doesn't either. Cohort 1, where they're now receiving the system and it might expect it to be really different, doesn't do it either. But Nicaraguan Sign Language 2 does, cohort 2 does, which suggests that it's only when home signers transmit it to the next generation, when the system is learned, that this plural marker is used in agent contexts, which suggests that there really are factors that can bring these new properties of language about, and an individual isn't necessarily going to be able to invent them on his own. So in general, what I'd like to say is that home sign gives us a window onto the properties of language that are so resilient they can be reinvented by a child. It's what Wendy called nature yesterday. On the other hand, the emergence of Nicaraguan Sign Language from home sign gives us a window onto the factors that make language grow beyond these fundamental properties that children can introduce, what Wendy called nurture. And we can get a handle on that by looking at the 3 different groups. Okay, so language is resilient. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. But it turns out gesture is resilient too. And unlike the person that Wendy showed yesterday, who was sitting there like this, clamped with his hands next to him, most people gesture when they talk. So here's an example of a gesture. She was asked to just say how you get from one place to another, and this is what she did.
Tell me everything that will pass as we walk through.
Okay, well, the front door, there's an entryway, and so as soon as you enter the front door, you're going to see Dash's shoes on the right on the floor, because they're dirty, so I don't take them in. And he'll come in, and, you know, he'll bend down and pick them up, and he'll bring them to you, and he wags his tail. You wag him, he's so funny. And so
Okay, so there's really nothing unusual about that woman's gestures. But there is something unusual about her that many of you may have noticed, which is that she is blind. Moreover, she's congenitally blind. She has never, ever seen anybody gesture. Nonetheless, when she starts to talk, up come her hands. Gesturing is actually really a fundamental part of speaking, and across the globe, when people talk, they also move their hands. So the question I'd like to ask is whether these gestures are more than just hand-waving. Are they really part of language? And the answer, obviously, I want to say yes. I want to tell you that gestures reflect what we know, and they can even play a role in changing what we know. So here's an example. This is a Piagetian task of conservation. What Piaget did is he gave children 2 rows of checkers, made sure that the kids thought there were the same number of checkers in the 2 rows, and then he sneakily spread one out. And he asked the kids, are there the same number of checkers or a different number of checkers? And non-conservers say it's a different number of checkers. But what I'm interested in is how they explain that belief and what they produce in both their mouths and in their hands. So this is a child who says they're different number. She says they're different because you spreaded them out. She says spreading them out, and she also gestures spreading them out.
Do these 2 rows of checkers have the same number of checkers? No. Which row has more checkers in it? Now, why does that have more checkers in it?
You spread them apart and this one stay like you put them down.
Okay, so she's produced what I've been calling a gesture-speech match. She's talking about spreading, she's gesturing about spreading. And contrast her with this next kid. Says exactly the same thing. They're different because you move them. But watch his hands. What he does is he does this. That's not how anybody moved the checkers. That's actually pairing up the checkers in one row with the checkers in another row, which is pretty clever. And it's different from what he's saying.
Do our rows have the same number of checkers in them now or different? Why is there a different number in our rows?
Because you moved them.
So he's produced what I would call a mismatch. He's talking about moving, but he's gesturing about one-to-one correspondence. So when we found kids like that, we thought maybe they think a little different. They're in a different cognitive state from matching kids. So we gave them all instruction to see whether they differed in the likelihood of profiting from that instruction. And what you see in this slide is children who identified as matchers in white prior to instruction, children identified as mismatchers in blue, and on the y-axis, this is the proportion of kids who improved after instruction. They all started at 0. Okay. And what you can see is that the children who are mismatchers, who produce gestures that were different from their speech, are more likely to learn than children who are matchers. Now, this isn't true only of conservation, it's also true of other tasks. I'm going to give you one other illustration. It's a math task, obviously. 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals blank plus 5. Kids in 4th and 5th grade kids in America actually get this problem wrong routinely. And what they do when they get it wrong is either they add up all the numbers on the left side of the problem, and they put 12 in the blank, or they add up all the numbers entirely, and they put 17 in the blank. But even though it's early in the morning, I think you all know that what you do here is you cancel out the 2 5s, you add 3 plus 4, and you put 7 in the blank. Okay, here's a kid who added up the numbers on the left side of the problem, and she says that in both her gesture and her speech.
How did you get 12 is your answer?
85 plus 4 plus 2.
She points at the 5 and the 4 and the 3. She produced a match, adding up numbers in the equal sign in both speech and gesture. Watch this one. She says exactly the same thing. She says, I added up the 5 and the 4 and the 3. But watch her hands. What she does is she first points at that other 5, and then the other 5, 4, and the 3. So what she's gesturing is about adding up all the numbers in the problem, but she's talking about adding up only the numbers to the equal sign.
I added 5, and then the 4, and then the 3 too.
So she's produced a mismatch. She's giving 2 different strategies, one in speech and one in gesture. Again, we gave them all instruction. They all started at 0. And what we find is precisely the same kind of pattern that we found for conservation. It's the mismatchers, the kids identified as mismatchers prior to instruction, who are ready to learn and ready to profit from that instruction. Okay? So gesturing reflects what people know. Gesturing is a really important part of language. It isn't just a random event here. It's central to language. Note that it's not that they're either gesturing or not gesturing. They are all gesturing. It's the relation of the gesture to the speech that matters here. So gesturing reflects what speakers know. It can also play a role in changing what they know. So to explore this, what we did was we manipulated the gestures that children produce during learning. And we taught the kids to say, I want to make one side of the problem equal to the other side, which is the equalizer strategy. And they were told to say these words before and after solving each problem. So here's one example.
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
And here's a kid who was taught to make a gesture, a grouping gesture, point at the 3 plus 2 and point at the blank.
So first of all, can you say the words and do the hand movements exactly like we practiced?
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay.
Okay, they were all given instruction, and what we found is that the children who produced speech plus gesture were much more likely to learn than the kids who produced speech alone, suggesting that gesturing is playing a role in learning. But why? What's it doing? What we think is that gesture is grounded in action. It is an action, but it also has a role in representation. And so perhaps it can be used to bring learners, not just children, from the more concrete to the more abstract. So we taught children 3 different kinds of movements that varied in how grounded they were. Either children did action, so they literally picked up these little objects, the 5 and the 7, and they held it under the blank or in the blank. Or they did a concrete gesture, the same movements, but without touching the objects.
To the other side. Okay.
Or they did an abstract gesture.
One side equal to the other side.
And then we gave them a post-test. They were all trained on problems where you have 5 plus 7 plus 4 equals blank plus 4. But they were tested on exactly the same sorts of problems, different numbers, but the same format. And here are the 3 different groups that you see. And what you find is that all of the children succeeded in all 3 groups. So there are no differences between the action condition, the concrete gesture condition, or the abstract gesture condition. But we also gave them a transfer problem. So we gave them problems on which 3 plus 8 plus 2 equals 3 plus blank. Notice that if you add up the first 2 numbers in this problem and put that number in the blank, you're going to get it wrong. You have to figure out what the principle is underlying this in order to get it right. And what happened here is that the action kids drop off. They can learn how to solve this problem, but they can't generalize what they've learned, whereas kids in the concrete gesture and the abstract gesture can. Okay. So action helps kids learn the problems on which they're taught, But gesture helps them extend that knowledge to new problems. So language is resilient, can't come out of the mouth, comes out of the hands. Gesture is resilient, comes for free with language, and it helps us think. So the last point I'd like to make harkens back to what Wendy was talking about yesterday. If gesture is so resilient, signers should do it too. And it turns out signers do gesture. The question that I want to ask is whether gesture has the same cognitive functions in signers and in speakers. And answering this question actually allows us to disentangle a very tricky point about gesturing. So why does gesturing lead to change? And one hypothesis is that it's because you're taking your hands and your mouth, and you're doing a multimotor event. And that's what's important about gesture. But the other possibility is that gesture conveys information in a more mimetic way, and speech conveys information in a more categorical, discrete way. And maybe it's putting those two different representational formats together and producing them at the same time that's really important. You can't pull those two things apart with hearing gesturers, but you can with signers, because they don't use two modalities. Everything's coming out in their hands. They do, however, use two representational formats. So we asked two questions. Do signers produce gesture-sign mismatches? And do they predict readiness to learn? So going back to mathematical equivalence, this is a deaf child who is answering one of these problems, and what she says is that 5 minutes left, right? Or are we done with 30 minutes?
Now we have 5 more minutes for questions.
Okay, I'm almost done. Okay, can I?
So there won't be a lot of time for questions.
Okay, there won't be a lot of. I can stop now. Shall I stop now? No? Okay. All right, I'll talk very fast. Okay, this is a deaf child, and what the deaf child does is she says, I'm adding up all of the numbers in her sign, and then for gesturing, she points at each 4 of these things. Okay, so I'm adding all, bunk, 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 da-dum. Okay, so her sign strategy is add up all the numbers. Her gesture strategy is to do all 4 of these numbers. The proportion of problems on which she gestured, 80%. Is that a lot or a little? It's pretty much the same as what hearing kids do. But now the crucial question is, do they do mismatches? And in fact, they do. So here's an example of a mismatch. This child adds up 3 numbers on the left side and puts the answer in the blank. But at the same time, she does a gesture covering that ugly 7 that doesn't really need to be there. Okay. So here, watch her. Okay, so her sign is to add up and put them in the blank, but her gestures indicate this 7, which is really sort of subtracting. So she's doing different information, basically. That's the point in gesture and speech. Proportion of children who produce 3 or more of these mismatches, pretty comparable to what hearing kids do. So now here's the crucial question, and then I'm almost done. What I've arrayed here is the number of children who produce 0 mismatches, 1 mismatch, 2 mismatches, and what I'm going to show you is the proportion of children in each bin who make progress on the task. They were all at 0. So the question is now, how many of these kids improve after instruction? And they had to get 5 out of the 6 problems right. If mismatch is important for signers as well as speakers, then we should find that few mismatches predict little learning, and lots of mismatches predict a lot of learning, and that's exactly what we find. Put in the terms that I showed you before, this is the graph I showed you earlier, the deaf kids look pretty much identical. It's really pretty much the same. So gesture-sign mismatch predicts learning as well as gesture-speech mismatch does, which suggests this isn't about hand and mouth. Bodies may be important, and we can talk about that, but it's not the whole story here. What matters more is the way in which the information is being represented, and that may give gesture its power. So, to summarize, language is resilient, gesture is resilient, both speech and sign. And to bring things together, what our hands can tell us about how we talk and think. The first point is the point that Wendy made yesterday. Home sign is not the first step, and this is not language evolution. We're talking about people who have modern-day brains. But it is an instance of language emergence. And what the data can tell us is how much linguistic structure an individual child can bring to language learning. The data from Nicaraguan Sign Language, the emergence of sign language, can tell us how learning changes that language. And finally, I think we have to take gesturing much more seriously when we're talking about language. We can't really look at people who are talking like this, because gesture is very fundamental to language, to both speech and to sign. It tells us how people are thinking, and more important, how they're generalizing what they learn across problems. Okay? I want to end by thanking my collaborators. Thank you for listening, and thank my funders. Okay. Sorry. Go on, Sonia.
So I think we have time for just one quick question.
Excellent, very interesting. I was wondering if in certain cultures in which gestures are not really allowed or promoted.
What that would do to your thinking?
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, but I'm going to challenge the presupposition. Because although we think there are certain cultures like Italians and Southern Europeans who gesture all the time, it turns out when you actually do the studies, the rate of gesturing in Northern and Southern Europe is pretty much the same. What differs is the size of the gesture. The number of emblems, things like this, Italy has more of them than Sweden. But if you look at and the size of the gesture, Italians gesture big, but the rates of the gesture are pretty much the same. However, if there really were differences like that, I think I would have to predict that something fundamental is going on in thinking. If you allow them to do it. Yeah, what happens in a culture where people are told to keep their hands still? Right, I think that's a bad thing. In America, what's happening in school systems is they're telling boys to sit still. I think it's terrible for their cognition.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm sorry we don't have enough more time. Okay, our next speaker asked to be introduced as a poet. His name is Alex Ben-Ari, and he promised to tell us more about this in his talk.
So, can you hear me? Yeah, you can. So, hi everyone. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope poetry throws in something interesting to the mix we're having here. And just by way of introduction, and actually mostly to get used to hearing myself echo in English, which I'm not used to do. I think this is the first talk I ever gave in English. Let me tell you a little bit about myself to get us started. So I'm a poet. I published 3 books so far. Oddly enough, each one of them is in a very different genre. And somewhat alarmingly, this trend is continuing with what I'm doing today. So we'll see how that ends up. And the first one was Concealed Seas in 2008. It's a book of lyrical poetry. The next one, The Gatepost, was 2014. It's a book of haiku poetry. It's the Japanese short form. And around that time, several friends and I also started a small publishing house called Waning Moon Press, which is dedicated to haiku poetry in Hebrew. It's active till this day. And the next one, 2018, was called Hatikva 69. It's a book of conceptual poetry, and it contains 69 variations of the Israeli national anthem Hatikva, together computed variations, together with the second part of the book is an annotated email correspondence between myself and the Israeli Academy of the Hebrew Language. And around that time, also, as my interest in conceptual poetry and the ecosystem around it grew in Hebrew, they also edited 2 anthologies of conceptual writing in Hebrew. So that's that, and it worked. I'm used to speaking English now. So this is our talk, Creating Creation, a Trail Through Conceptual Poetry. And maybe to start us off, we'll talk about what conceptual poetry is, and I won't be giving an exhaustive definition, but just a working definition to get us through this talk. So the first thing to say, I think, is conceptual poetry is a type of poetry. And by this, I mean that it aims to do exactly what all other types of poetry aim to do, which is, perhaps somewhat coarsely put, is to transcend our day-to-day levels of communication and perception, and to touch upon some aspect of being which is not expressible using words. And interestingly enough, this is done using words. So somehow this magic happens. So in this sense, it's the same as all other types of poetry. What sets it apart, is the way this goal is achieved. So regular poetry works through a very central concept there is craft. I mean, through ingeniousness of craft, beauty is created, and this beauty arouses emotion, and this is where poetry meets its readers and starts its work. In conceptual poetry, it's almost craftless or craft-free. Yesterday we saw it's not the same, but I'll go with craftless. It's centered around a different mechanism. The central concept there is process. The work of conceptual poetry is usually the execution of a very simple, well-defined, well-documented process, and its execution materializes, hopefully in a very rich way, an idea, a concept, and this concept meets the reader's mind, and this is where it starts working. So these are poetries that work on very different levels to achieve the same goal. And I want to give maybe an intuition for that can come from the visual arts where we're more exposed to them, so maybe it's clearer to demonstrate it through that. So here's the analog to lyrical poetry, perhaps. It's the Mona Lisa, Da Vinci. You can see, I think, or you already know it, what I spoke about, it's ingeniousness of craft, creating beauty, creating emotion, and this is where the piece starts to work. And the equivalent is this seminal work. The conceptual equivalent is this seminal work from Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, 1917, The Fountain, which is craftless. It's just a simple, very simple procedure of taking a ready-made object, putting it on a pedestal, putting that in a museum, and this materializes or explores the idea that art is possibly what we look at in the context of art. Anything that we will look at in the context of art is art. So this is all like well known, but I think it demonstrates the difference. So today, when I say a trail through, I mean I won't be covering, of course, all conceptual poetry or nothing near that. That's not possible. I just selected a short path through it, which I thought would be interesting and perhaps even relevant in this context. And it's all about this creating creation. And by this, I mean that I want to talk about this leap or this sort of even miracle that happens when you take words and they become art. They become a different word, means of communication entirely. If you put them in a certain order, the same words that are day-to-day words that you use in shopping lists or Facebook posts or work emails, you put them, suddenly when you put a bunch of them in a certain order, in a certain form, they become something completely different, a different type of matter. So I want to explore how that happens, and by close reading two works of conceptual poetry. And conceptual poetry is, I think, particularly lends itself to such observations because it's so transparent, because of this idea of process that you can see how the work is like a see-through engine. You can see exactly how the work is constructed. So maybe it's easy to see, or possible to see, where the magic starts to happen. So I want to talk, the first work I want to talk about is this one. And this is a work from 2018 by Canadian conceptual poet Christian Bock. And as you can see, there are several parts to it, and we'll go over all of them, but let me give you the bottom line of where I'm going with talking about it first. I want to talk about it to be centered around the concept which I'll call alignment of diversities. I think this is this poem's answer to the question of creation. And by alignment of diversities, I mean that if you take, there's this phenomena that if you take several elements which are very different, and you put this diversity, you put them together, all this diversity, and so a lot of interactions and contexts begin to happen in your mind, and things begin to get thick and open up with meaning. But if at the same time you manage to keep the whole thing from falling apart, you manage to keep it aligned in a tightly knit structure keep all of them aligned towards the same place, then as you keep adding more and more elements, there's a certain tipping point after which there's this transformation happens. It's as if the structure cannot contain any longer all this immense amount of context and interactions, and but it also doesn't fall apart. And then the transformation occurs. And of course, you can't really say mathematically how many elements and etc., because it depends on the elements, on the type of alignment. But I think generally this is what is going on. So maybe this sounds a little bit abstract, but I want to show it very concretely in this work. So the first part I'll talk about is one part you're actually not seeing, and these are the notes that accompany the work that describe the procedure of how the work is made. So I'll read to you from them. The Great Order of the Universe is a response to the 50th anniversary of the Lego patent. The image enumerates every possible way of combining 2 Lego bricks, each with 8 pegs. So this is the top part there. The poem starts with an image, actually. And I think it's a visually pleasing image. It's also intellectually interesting, like to get all the combinations. I find it also exciting in a sort of geekish way a little bit, because you immediately start messing with it. And did he really get all the combinations? How did he order them? What would happen if you have 2 by 2, etc.? But most of all, its take on the general concept of the Great Order of the Universe is that it presents a very small, like sort of ideal universe which we can know everything about, and it enumerates all the knowledge about this universe. And this universe is just this 5 by 5 where you have 2 elements, and all their combinations are everything that exists in this universe. So this is the first element. The second element, there are 2 caption texts beneath, and let's read the first one. So this is from Democritus, the Greek philosopher. This is about 400 BC. And it's from a piece called The Great Order of the Universe, same as Bock's work. Atoms bombard the unplumbable void, plunging like silvery raindrops or drifting like twinkly hoarfrosts. And by coalescing, if kindred, they cause things to appear. And by separating, if opposed, they cause things to vanish. And from these interknit vectors, objects interlock, forever becoming one prolific universe, distinctive for its mild infinitude of forms. So this is a beautiful text, I think. It's both lyrical and very clear. And it's a text, it's not an image, so we already have 2 very different elements. And it's also describing a very different universe. It's describing the opposite, perhaps, the whole universe, everything that is in existence, how it comes to be, and what is the order that governs it. But at the same time, you can see, obviously, the similarity, because it's instead of Lego bricks, we have something called atoms, but the mechanism is the same. They come together, they're taken apart, and by this, everything comes to be. The other text is by another man, slightly later, some 2,300 years later, Gottfried Kirk Christiansen, and this is actually from the Lego patent number 3,005,282. Toy elements of this kind will be referred to generally as building bricks, and the principal object of the invention is to provide improved coupling means for clamping such building bricks together in any desired relative position, thus providing for a vast variety of combinations of the bricks for making toy structures of many different kinds and shapes. So completely different texts in tone. It's not a scientific or philosophical, it's a legal document, actually, very technical. Still beautiful in a sense, because it's very clear and its use of language is very precise. And again, it describes yet another completely different universe. A universe where it's sort of, I think, the equivalent of Democritus for the world of Lego, for the image. It expands it to, if we have all Lego pieces, how will the world behave in this way? And it's also another big difference is that it's very utilitarian and Homo sapiens centered, like it's for our use, what we can do with Lego bricks. So we have these three elements all aligned to the same notion of describing the order of the universe, but all three very different from each other. And this is the point where Christian Bock weaves a magic spell of sorts. And I'll read to you from the notes again. The caption consists of two texts. The first, a translated paragraph from a volume by Democritus. The second, a transcribed paragraph from the patent by Gottfried Kirk Christiansen. The two paragraphs are perfect anagrams of each other. So here be the magic spell. Perfect anagrams means that if you take any of these two texts and you break it up into letters and you put the letters in a bag and you shake the bag and you spill them back on the table, you can construct the other texts letter by letter, and you'll have no letters left over. So these texts are the exact equivalent of each other in both type of letters and number of letters, which is a pretty amazing feat in itself, but it also introduces a new element into this structure, which is from a completely different place. It introduces language itself as a set of Lego bricks of sorts, which we can combine and take apart to create, and we've just experienced this as readers, how different are the things that this universe of language can create. So we have a completely new element, which is pointing at the same direction, and it's actually also creating part of the other elements. So it's a whole new dimension of complexity here. And possibly this is where, for me at least, possibly this is where the tipping point happens, where the work becomes so rich that it can no longer be contained in your mind, even as a reader, and you have to experience it on a different level. But it goes on also, I think, the last thing, as you leave the work, you can again look at it as a picture, like we started looking at it as an image, but to look at the whole thing as an image. And then maybe you can notice that the whole thing looked at as an image actually resembles, in a way, a Lego brick, right? The way it's constructed. And I don't think this is a coincidence. It introduces yet another element of where the work itself demonstrates how each of its components is another element in a small order of the universe, quote unquote, of the work itself. So I hope I hope as we're talking about it, I hope you at some point experience this leap from alignment of the diversities into like something completely different, which is what we call like art, or what the artistic effect, or what poetry aims to do. How are we? Worse than I thought. Okay. So I wanted. Yeah, let's talk about it. I want to talk about another poem, a much shorter one. It's from 1965 by American Armenian poet Aram Saroyan. It's very short. I'll leave you with it for a few seconds so you can read it carefully. So, and again, let me give you the bottom line up front. I want to talk about this poem through a concept of productive error. I think there's something jarring about it. You probably noticed even from the 10 seconds you spent about it. It sort of stops you short. You try to read it, you try to interact with it. You know it's a poem, so you know what to do when you see a poem, but you can't really do it. It stops you. And in this sense, it's an error. It's a problematic poem. It's a bad poem because it doesn't give you what you need as a reader. But what makes it productive, I think, is that because he somehow managed to create this error that it stops you on the one hand, but it also gives you something in return. And this something is a lot of new information, which you wouldn't have noticed if you would have just gone about your regular reading. And I want to show how all these types of information now start to emerge because you are jarred and stopped. And then tie it also to the same concept of alignment of diversities. So the first thing is maybe, let's start with a very simple question, maybe how many words long is this poem? So there's the obvious answer of 1, because it's 1 word. And there's also the obvious answer of 0, because this is not a word. And also I would argue that there's another answer of maybe somewhere between 1 and 2, because it's both a word and not a word. It's a word, because we all know that it's light, but there's also this extra layer of information of the spelling mistake. So it's somewhere between 1 and 2. So something as trivial as counting the number of words suddenly becomes more vague or less solid or less more dualistic. And another question we can ask, you've actually all experienced it now, is have you read this poem? I mean, can we read this poem? So again, obviously the answer is yes, you've just read it. But I think the answer is also not really, because there's no reading process in the normal sense. You look at this poem more like you look maybe at a sculpture or a photograph. So it's sort of, because it jars your reading, it brings it to this extreme case where there's only 1 word and it's not even a word, so reading also suddenly becomes not so obvious. And like what reading is exactly at this edge case. So this is the pattern here. This poem will take all these basic concepts and it opens them up. It shows that they're not, the only reason that they're so solid and non-vague is that you just don't think about them, or you just go, they're like that for the regular case, but when you start going to the edges, you see that they open up into something much less definite. Another thing we can talk about is because you cannot just read this word and move on, there's this slight delay between seeing it and understanding what it means. So it makes one reflect on the fact that there really is a gap between a word, and it was actually discussed yesterday in several of the talks. It was mentioned there's a gap between the word and its meaning, like its physical form and its meaning. It's not the same thing. And this word here has 2 senses, right? It's the opposite of, or not heavy and not dark. So if we look at it for a minute as the not heavy, let's start with that. So the word light as not heavy, if you look at it from the physical, at its physical form, it's not very light, isn't it? Like it's 5 characters long. It's not an ideal choice for a word whose semantics is not heavy. Like the average length of a word in English is 4.7 characters. So that's even longer than the average. And this is for a word that should mean not heavy. And the gesture he does of doubling the GH actually is also a bit vague, because it both makes it worse, because it takes it to 7 characters, but it also makes it better, I think, because he actually doubles the part. He notices, the poet, that the GH is slightly of a different material than the L and the I and the T, right? It's the part that has no sound. I mean, not exactly no sound, but almost no sound. And so it's, in a sense, it's the more airy part of the word. And when you double it, you sort of get the word is longer, but it's also less dense, in a sense. So it's actually making it longer and lighter at the same time. So it's interesting. And again, follows the same pattern of making things vaguer or more dualistic and exposing the tension between these 2 patterns of the words. I have time for one more. So let's look at light as the opposite of dark. And here, again, if we look at the physical form of the word, you can see it's exactly opposite than the semantics because it's dark, like literally dark, right? The word, any word, you're right, is dark because it blocks, it has ink and it blocks the white of the paper. So there's again this tension there between the physical form and the semantics. And also, and I think this is also a nod to the dual nature of light from physics, he shows us there's also this duality in the word itself. On the one hand, it's one word, it's a particle of meaning. On the other hand, you can see, and the doubling of the GH accentuates this, that it's also a stream of characters that is moving from left to right. So it's at the same time, it's one thing, but it's also a movement. And this doubling of the GH even has this nice wavy pattern to it, which is also a nod, I think, to the nature of light. So we see here, I'm wrapping this up, there are other elements which we can talk about, but I want to leave time. So I hope you see that it opens up multiple contexts, and here I'm tying back to alignment of diversities. It opens up multiple channels of new information, this poem, but all this information is aligned in the same direction. It's very different from each other. We talked about physical form versus semantics, about the limits of reading, about counting. So all of these are very diverse in nature, but they're all aligned towards the same idea that things are, like the fact that things are solid is not sort of a law of nature or deterministic. It's not the law of nature. It's just an artifact of whether we are, what state we're in as readers, in a sense. And anything as trivial as counting, as reading, can be taken to the limits, and then it opens up and demonstrates a completely different nature, much less solid. So, so this is what I leave you with, I think, these two poems. Thank you. Time's up.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Alex. I would like to make a comment and to ask a question. The comment is about the GH, which I personally like very much. The GH is the only letters in this word which are not pronounced in English. So originally the pronunciation was Licht, as you know, but in English they are silent. By reduplicating the GH, you kind of give voice to the silent. With regard to the question, my question is about craftlessness or craft-freeness. It strikes me that Demokritos obviously wrote in Greek, and therefore whoever produced this anagram had to translate Demokritos into English. I don't know about Christiansen's Danish, whether it was in Danish or in English because it was an international patent. But what I'm trying to say is that it looks to me that this is the opposite of craftlessness, in the sense that it is constrained literature. You translate into English knowing that you must use these specific letters, otherwise it will not be an anagram. So it's the opposite of what you showed us, Mona Lisa, as opposed to the other thing that was kind of what people criticize for modern art. This is actually constrained literature, which in my view is a very beautiful way of forcing yourself to be creative. So constrained literature is the easiest way for creation. In poetry, you have rhyme, which is constrained literature, but when you write a palindromic story, or when you write an anagram story, this is even more creative because you must use something that otherwise you would have never used.
So thanks. It's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. It's very true. This anagram it's an amazing feat of constrained literature, and it's not in this sense. This work is I wouldn't call it craft-centered though. It's still craftless or almost craftless in the sense that it's not centered around craft. Like, it's not the point of the of the work. It does contain and usually this is the part which is not so typical to conceptual poetry. It does contain an element. One of the elements was crafted, but it's only one of the elements. It's not actually so important whether Christian Bock did it or someone else did it for him. It's not so, it wouldn't change anything in the work. So the work is about the whole structure, which is very simple and very well defined, etc., and aims to materialize this idea. But you're right that this component, which is, but it's sort of like a ready-made in a sense. We know it was really crafted, but it's the same as maybe Duchamp's urinal. I mean, he could have used like a Greek, well, he couldn't have used a Greek sculpture, but he could have used something which was ingenious, engineering-wise, and put that as well. Okay. Any more?
My question is more about how poetry contributes to the creation or the changes of language, because I've heard two different arguments, and this word kind of makes me think about it. The first is that language is lazy in a way, so like lazy. So like it evolves through minimizing the efforts that we make with sound. And the other one is that language is also created by acts of art and like poetry and changes of meaning. And so when you get a word like this, which is long, how, I mean, like it makes us think a lot, but how would it contribute to our innovation in language and change in language? If that makes sense. Yeah, cool.
So I think, first of all, I don't think it's a goal for poetry to change language, but it could be a side effect that happens many times, that poets create new words or use words, create new compounds, and I think maybe what I can say about that is the big contribution of poetry, both by writers and for readers as well, for users of the languages. It reminds us the amount of freedom we have with regard to the language, that we're not trapped inside the language in a sense, but it's just a medium through which we travel, and we can get to places which are indescribable by language. So given that freedom, this internal freedom about it, it makes us more maybe agile about it, both as readers and writers and as users of the language.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.
Our third speaker is Uri Alon, who did his PhD in physics and switched to biology in his postdoc. His lab at Weizmann studies biological circuits and also aspects of human behavior. He's also a playback theater actor and will conduct tonight's playback theater performance at 7 o'clock in the evening. His talk will be about body language.
Okay, so hi everyone. I see the time. Thank you. And thanks, Tzachi, for inviting me to this really amazing and unique interdisciplinary meeting. And this talk will also be interdisciplinary. It kind of came from a urge to connect my life as in looking at biological data and my life as a theater actor, and to try to study how theater works a little bit. And the focus will be about body language. And if you look at this image, or if you look at people interacting, we can describe it in what's going on here in different ways. You can probably think maybe of a story going on here. There's emotions, there's actions, etc. And in fact, when we look at images like this, we get a lot of information very quickly from the body, not only from words, and in many cases, body communicates a lot of information, but what is it saying? And that's something a little bit confusing, because we don't, if we want to talk about what the body is saying. And in psychology and in people who study body language, there's a kind of mainstream focus on the body trying to transmit the state of the person. Like adjectives like, this person is angry, emotions, happy, sad, triumphant, sympathetic. A lot of work about that. And we'll try to, for example, in this book, Emotions in the Body by Beatrice de Gelder, the emotional body language, it feels like that. And even actually Darwin's book, Expression of Emotions in Animals and Man, Darwin was thinking about this also. In theater, you look at it in a different way. It's not about emotions, it's about something else called dramatic actions. And theater is very practical, so it's not translated into science, like what we call quantitative science or scientific paradigms, and that's my goal. So to talk about how theater looks at body language, and we'll try to find out what is somehow, how can we test whether it's emotions or verbs or both, which speaks more. Did I explain myself? That's the goal, these two theories. I see you nodding. So, in psychology, work like Paul Ekman's is very influential and now is being revised, where people can identify from the face basic emotions, happy, angry, sad, etc., in different cultures, even though that's, again, being revised. And more recent work, research identifies 20 emotions plus, like, including being triumphant, guilty, embarrassed, sympathetic, ashamed, things like that. And if you ask actors to portray emotions, people can see in the body and emotions, even if you don't have the face. That's clear, and also, even when you look at things like that, your brain sometimes responds quicker than even looking at faces, and your muscles in your body want to run away when you see an attacking gesture, so it's powerful information. And sometimes it's the body telling us what's going on. So it turns out that extreme emotions look very similar. It's the body that tells you whether the point was won or lost. And in fact, it's the same face planted in these two figures. Same face, but the body tells you whether it's joy or anguish. This is work by Aviezer at Hebrew University. So these are all emotional states in the body, and also other kind of states like status. So like you can portray high status or you can portray low status. Very clear to us with body language. So that's like, let's say, a mainstream way of looking. Body language tells about the state of the person. But in theater, you look at body language differently. This is Konstantin Stanislavski, is a major theater director who wrote about this and used it. And he noticed that when you tell actors to portray an emotion, you get bad acting. And he found it much more effective to ask actors to think about what they're trying to do to the other character. So he called this dramatic action. It's the effort to change the state of the other actor. It's not a state, it's a vector. It's an effort to change the state. And that's can be described as certain kind of active verbs, like to threaten. To threaten is an effort to change the state of the other person. It might work or not work, but the audience can get it. And according to theater, everything you do on stage, everything you say, and every motion you make must have a dramatic action, otherwise you get something that's very artificial. And when I say whatever you can say the same words with different dramatic actions. You can say, come here, please, in a way that's threatening, come here, please. Or comforting, come here, please. Or seducing, whatever. You see what I mean? Also motion. So like if I want to touch this thing, it's not just an activity. I can touch this in a threatening way, right? I can threaten you. Or in a supportive way, or etc. Everything. So actors have a piece of text and they underline little bits of it and say, what dramatic action? And you change dramatic actions. You're trying to influence the other person. And according to this point of view, even in real life, we don't think about it, we don't mean to, but we do dramatic actions constantly as an effect. So that's very different from emotion. And so these are cartoons. So dramatic action is like an arrow. It's a vector. It's an effort. And it works. It's going to work if you can imagine what the face of the other person would look like. To annoy, you can imagine the face if it works. It doesn't have to work. As opposed to adjectives like angry, sad, which are states of the person. So it's two different things. And they're different because you can threaten someone while you're angry, while you're sad, while you're happy. Well, they're different things. According to theater, this is just a practice, a very practice because you're desperate to make something on stage that has a purpose. So here we try to operationalize it or try to scientificize it or something like that. And Yuval Liron joined me on this adventure. He's from Talpiot, like me. He studied physics, math, and then he became a theater director. He's an award-winning theater director, and he's also a mathematician. He works at Weizmann part-time with me. So first step was to look at all the active verbs where X does something to Y. There's thousands of them, and using databases, you could collect them, cluster them according to meaning, like all these clusters. You can do that automatically. And then we chose according to frequency. So you have these databases of word frequency, and chose the most frequent words that look at a cluster of meaning and come up with a list of 22 dramatic actions like that. And then came up with a set of cartoons which are very expressive, like this is supposed to be to bully. See this, 46? And the question was, can people see these and first agree on what dramatic action is there? Right? Because maybe it's just us, because we're so in love with this theater thing, maybe people can't agree. So we used Mechanical Turk, which is American people who work in Mechanical Turk. So you get some money for answering questionnaires like this, and we made sure that 50 people saw each of these cartoons and each of these words, like to humiliate, to support, to hurt, to offend, etc. And they had to do something to move this from 0 to 100, how much they agree. The person on the right is trying to humiliate the person on the left. So it's not very much in this particular questionnaire. Then we can get a lot of statistics from thousands of people. And we saw that people agree hugely on dramatic action. So 90% of the people would see soothe and comfort are high and low on this cartoon. It's a very strong signal that indeed people agree on dramatic actions. That's very basic for us. And also that when we asked about emotions, the dramatic actions are different from emotions because you can do a negative dramatic action like to bully or humiliate while you're happy or while you're angry. So people perceive you as angry. So they're different. We wanted to make sure they're different constructs. So that was like a step towards convincing ourselves that people agree on dramatic actions and that these words are useful. And then we wanted to go beyond cartoons and actor portraying and try to make a less... So we chose these to be very powerful cartoons. We wanted to make stimuli that are less designed. And what we wanted to do is to ask the following question. Suppose now it's dusk and you're walking and you see suddenly two people in the corner of your eye for a second, and you only see their outline. Can you understand what's going on? Can you understand what their body language is saying? Because we thought that would be a kind of an extreme case for testing dramatic action or maybe emotion. What is it that we see there? Because we thought maybe it'd be important for people to understand. And in order to do that, and also not to use actors, because actors have a lot of cultural kind of norms in what they do, or cartoons. We wanted to make an unbiased survey of the potential of the body to make these configurations, which you can see as a distance, so only very, very large-scale parts of the body. So we used stick figures. We made these stick figures with anatomical proportions. And stick figures, of course, have a low-dimensional representation. You can use these angles. And then, of course, the stick figures have been used before in different studies. And we based on the first study, we noticed that it's the upper body that's important, and we chose 5 angles. And with these 5 angles, you can make a lot of positions. And we basically decided on 5 values for some of these angles in order to make a large enough sampling of body configuration space, so about 1470 configurations. And we asked people about stick figures where one person has the configuration, another person is in a neutral pose, because we want to get it. Another thing that's important, we think about body language, these dramatic actions are dyadic. You need another person to do it. Even though you can make dramatic actions just on the air, you can imagine a person with a central dramatic action of to threaten, going home and threatening the air around them, right? In fact, in good theater, you make a character stuck in a dramatic action, like to threaten, and then you make that character try to beg someone not to leave them, for example. Now they have to go out of their threaten into something else, and that's very interesting drama. That's what you manipulate in theaters. And again, we did the questionnaires like this in Amazon, Mechanical Turk, and you ask people, the stick figure on the right is trying to the person on the left. And we gave them these 8 major dramatic actions that we got from the first study, are the main ones: to comfort, threaten, urge, scold, encourage, hurt, bully, etc. And ask people to rate. But other people, we used very similar questionnaires, but asked them about emotions. The person on the right is feeling happy, sad. And we used 20 different emotions. Each time we used like groups of 6 like that. And we made sure the different people answer about dramatic action and emotion. Sometimes we got the same people later on, so we could not bias people, etc. And what we saw is that, first of all, the configuration space, human configuration space, or stick figure configuration space is quite expressive. About half of these configurations, people agreed very strongly on what they see. So that's a lot of, even though they're like this, could be like, okay. And they agreed usually about a dramatic action and a little bit less about emotion. And about, let's say, 25% of the stick figures got only a strong dramatic action agreement, and about half of that only emotion agreement. And in the emotions, the 20 emotions we used, in fact, people mainly saw angry, confused, and embarrassed. The other ones were almost never seen. Whereas the dramatic actions, there were images for all the dramatic actions, including support, comfort, bully, hurt, etc. So from this we got a sense that you get people perceiving both emotions and dramatic actions, but dramatic actions are more found in more images, and also the emotions, it's only specific emotions that are seen, not the full range. And just another way, comes from biology. Okay? So when you look at gene expression data, we have powerful ways to look at it, so we did the same. Here are images, and here are the dramatic actions. And an image gets a color if the median score, that is to say, the median score for comfort was above 50. That means that people saw comfort and agreed that these images, let's say, are comfort. I'll show you the images soon. And what you see is a lot of color here in the dramatic action, and just a little bit of color in the emotion, mainly in angry. And we asked about the emotion of the neutral stick figure. You couldn't see basically anything. You can't agree on any. People saw different. And you can see that images that have one positive dramatic action, like to support, encourage, often have the others, or negative dramatic actions go together, bully, hurt, etc., even though they're images that are kind of pure only for one dramatic action. And angry goes together with these negative dramatic action, because they're found in the same images. Did I explain myself? The takeaway here is that dramatic action speaks louder than emotion verbs, you can say, and people perceive, even though both of them are found. Yeah. Now here is just examples. So let's say to comfort. These are the top stick figures for to comfort. This is to support, just to show you what it looks like, to encourage, like, come on. To urge, to hurt. Now, these are the negative ones. Now, look at the negative ones. To threaten. People agree that this person is trying to threaten. We call these the W's. The W like this. So here we start to think about, Tzachi, when he saw this, said like onomatopoeia. Is this stick figure telling us something about the muscle tension here and what this person might do in the next second, right? So this is also the issue of time. This is just a frame. We maybe get information from the time also. So these are like, you can say, stimuli. They're strongly perceived as certain dramatic actions. Now, emotions, also you found distinct figures that are strongest for each emotion. These are the strongest ones for afraid. Even though afraid was rarely seen, these are the top ones for afraid. The person is touching their head. Like that. Angry, that looks a little bit like bully and threaten. Confused, again touching the head or going like this. We think this may be have aspects of symbol in them. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's to stabilize the head, or maybe it's a symbol. Like, is this shame? Oh, by the way, I should say, it's a very special opportunity to lecture. It's the first time I lecture about this. So if you in the audience or experts have ideas for relevant studies that we probably don't know about and have been done, or how this connects to your work, this is my opportunity to get that information. So please tell me, or after the talk or in the lectures. Triumph, you can see also like, yeah. And here is another thing from biology. We could represent all 1470 body configurations in a kind of reduced dimensionality, like with single-cell gene expression. So these are similar body configurations, differed by only one angle, and paint on them the dramatic action. So the idea is that they're all regions of similar positions give you similar dramatic actions, but then there's also cases where you just move one angle and you go from positive to negative dramatic action. So the gray ones are images where people couldn't agree on a dramatic action. So you can see the continuity along certain dimensions of body space for dramatic actions. So I'll just show you a few of them. So like I said, the W configurations is a whole space that has to do with bullying and negative dramatic actions. But a tiny change. So this is something like a positive dramatic action, like to comfort or to encourage. And this one, where you change this angle, see, becomes to threaten. Just one specific. So some angles are very, very sensitive. Let's say on the meaning, the action. Arm pointing away is perceived to urge, and towards is angry. So the direction here matters. And the head touching, identified as surprised, confused, embarrassed. So it's good. I'm finishing 5 minutes ahead of time because I want to have extra time for discussion. I did it on purpose. And because I want to learn from you, basically. So looking from theater at body language, we come up with this concept of dramatic action. We can conceptualize it, try to, as active verb, and it looks like in this kind of unbiased survey of stick figures that both dramatic action and states like emotions are perceived, but dramatic action is more comprehensive, stronger signal, at least in this way we did the study. We couldn't have done this without Berginsky Center at Weizmann, which tries to find connections between natural science and humanities and arts. And maybe now, looking at this figure, maybe you can see dramatic actions here too. Now that we've been trained for a second, what kind of dramatic actions are done by both of them, actually? And maybe to add this layer to understanding what's going on when people are interacting with each other. There's another layer of second-to-second tactics. Okay, so I'll stop here. So we have a 9-minute question period. So
Thank you very much.
Let's do it.
Thank you. Fantastic. I love this. Two comments, I guess. One is about the fact that people couldn't identify emotions, but there were no faces. So perhaps the dramatic action is more in the body and the emotion is more in the face, which is actually not incompatible with Aviezer, because Aviezer only asked whether people won or lost. He didn't ask what emotion they were expressing. So it could be that if he would have gotten many more nuances if he had asked those sorts of questions from the face.
I agree. So the comment is that face is probably signaling emotion, and body is signaling dramatic action, and I agree. Yeah.
And we have a study that I'd love to talk to you about that relates to that. And the second question, if I may, is about basically what you were doing at the end, which is what we call minimal pairs in linguistics, where you have two expressions of any kind that differ in only one feature. And if that feature makes a difference in the interpretation, then that feature is relevant for the domain. So we have that in phonology and sound system, and we have it in many other aspects of linguistic structures. So perhaps, and you started to do that. So if you perhaps alter just one element and give people an option to judge what they see, then perhaps you'll be able to figure out the grammar of
Fantastic.
Of
So
body.
this minimal pair, the one angle change, it changes meaning. That's called minimal pair. I wasn't aware of that, and that's great. So we actually did all possibilities, so we can know all minimal pairs in this universe of Legos that we studied. So that will be very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, is there any way to know whether this study is culture-free or cultureless?
Yeah.
Because the Mechanical Turk, presumably, you have no way of knowing, or you can't control directly for the culture of your participants. And I wonder if you did control for the culture, whether you would be able to distinguish between these universal versus culture-particular kinds of results.
Yeah, so this comment is in Amazon Turk, we don't know the culture. And there's an option to do it also in India, which we didn't do, and that's definitely of interest to us. And I assume it's not culture-free. That's my...
Thank you very much. I was wondering if the fact that the person that the dramatic action was directed to did not change, whether this in any way can have influenced the interpretation of the dramatic action, because if the person does not react to something that is very obvious, this might be unnormal or might seem unnormal to someone who's looking at it. And have you tried to also change this side of the equation?
Yeah. So the question is, we chose to have the second person in a neutral position, and that might be perceived as unnatural because people tend to react to dramatic actions one way or the other. We didn't try in this study, but in other studies we kind of built a little program that can do. Yuval Lals is my partner in this study. Yuval Lals theater. So he would give the two ones dramatic actions and move them according to what we discovered. And then you get very powerful looking reactions, which are either congruent or not congruent. And dramatic actions in theater, we know they don't have to work. So it doesn't. We know in theater, the practice of theater, that the person looking at it, it doesn't have to work. And in fact, it's a matter of time. So it's supposed to try to comfort someone, that someone is like that. At first, you try to comfort them, and only later, a little bit later, they kind of this or that, and still you get the dramatic action. So we thought that it's kind of like the dramatic action before we know what happens. Did I explain myself? I'm sure it'll change things if the person reacts. So that's my attempt to answer. Did I answer?
Over here?
Yes.
I wonder if you thought at all about how gestures sort of work with body action of this sort. So does a director tell an actor how to move their hands as a gesture, or does that come for free? And What does a director do?
What does a
about
director
those
do?
kinds of- right.
So direction of this to gesture, and how does directors work? So directors, there's a whole spectrum. Some of them, especially in cinema, can be like, okay, move your chin 32 degrees to the right. That exists. But the Stanislavski method, the American method, what's called in-out method, is you don't do that. You tell the actor, you work with the actor on the dramatic action, and then let them filter through their being what that means, and it's going to be different every time the play is done also. So what's conserved is the effort to change the other person's state, but how you do it with the gestures, the voice, the timing, very important. Like I just try to manipulate, right? The timing words. So all these are in the American method, which is actually Stanislavski method transported to the US, are the interpretation of the actor, you can say. Otherwise, it's believed that you get what's called fake acting, disgusting, like Stanislavski goes, repulsive acting or something.
Do you think your stick figures are gesturing?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that in your talk. Are you asking artist stick figures gesturing? Yeah. So I have to talk with you about it because I don't know about gesturing. So I got from you the gesturing accompanies speech. These dramatic actions don't necessarily have to accompany speech, and they. I think that probably if I'm gesturing to you about, let's say, okay, here's my dog is jumping on me, I can add to that a layer of trying to affect your state. So I can talk about the dog in a way that will encourage you or will threaten you. So on top of the gesturing, there's a prosody of gesturing or something where I would try to think about, what am I trying to do to you? By the way, most of it, thankfully, is not deliberate or conscious even. We do these without thinking about them, and we receive them. By the way, we receive them very strongly, and sometimes we don't know what triggered us. This kind of, a psychologist, somebody calls it transference. So this person asks you a question at a conference. The content is perfectly reasonable, but you feel like you're shrinking and you want to just vanish. It's because the dramatic action was maybe bullying, but the content is very supportive. It could be. Maybe that person is stuck in a bullying dramatic action. They have no choice, almost no choice. So that's why, like when I get questions, I always try to repeat them in the speaker's own word in a supportive dramatic action, no matter what the dramatic action. And then everyone relaxes, and I can listen to it. But I think being literate about dramatic actions is extremely important for human beings to separate out the layers of meanings and be less vulnerable to manipulations, which are actually a lot of times unconscious manipulations, which bear a lot of weight in our perception. I don't know if it's relevant, but I think it's, when you talk about gesturing, I got thinking about cognitive processes and information transfer and a kind of augmentation to speech. And on top of that, we can think of another layer, which is my influence tactic, which is an emotional attempt to, or status. I want to increase my status or decrease my status. I'm trying to decrease it. It's so cute. I'm now heading a committee, but first I want to apologize that I'm late. I'm reducing my status. That's very powerful. This could be, or now, okay, we're going to talk about 3 candidates, and by the end of this meeting, we'll have a list of, now I'm high status. I'm a status player in order to achieve a desired goal, which is to keep the emotions and the relationships intact. So these are very important, I think, to be literate about it. We're even thinking maybe to have like an app about teaching about dramatic action. So you can turn it into words and cognitive. Okay. More questions.
Time for a very short question. Last one.
Okay, so it's more than a comment than a question. Thank you. Maybe I'm stating the obvious, but I would like to advise to look at what's been done in conversation analysis and interactional linguistics. Analysts basically look at videotape, like natural interactions, and analyze, among other stuff, the gestures and facial expressions and bodily postures. Basically, these paradigms in linguistics look at language as a vehicle for social action, which is kind of consistent with what you're saying about dramatic action. And begin with Adam Candon and
I know about
Charles
that.
Goodwin.
Yes. So this you're mentioning literature about like second by second analysis of videos of conversation and looking at one person is moving like this, the other person is moving like this, and good timing and with the speech.
Yeah, the sequential positioning is very
It's
central in this analysis.
how important it is sequential.
The sequential positioning, like everything makes relevant something next. So it looks at interaction as a sequence of moves.
As a time series where each event sets up the meaning for the next. So I'd be grateful if you could give me some references. We maybe missed, especially new ones, about this field. And I think I emerged with a good like knapsack of information from this question period. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Coffee break. Okay, we'll reconvene at 11:35.
Good compromise.
Welcome back. Okay, welcome back. So after the coffee break, in this session, we will have two speakers. The first one is Tal Dagan from Israel. The second one is Eske Willerslev, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, thank you very much. Tal will talk about microbes, cyanobacteria, and how they evolve. And then Eske will talk about ancient DNA. So a very short introduction. I mean, both speakers have very long CVs, so I will let them speak by themselves. And let me first introduce Tal Dagan. She's a professor of microbiology at the University of Kiel. Her research interests focus on studying microbial genomes using phylogenomic network approaches. Tal explores interspecies lateral gene transfer, the selective role in adaptive selection, and its implications for evolution. So Professor Tal will talk about evolution of multicellularity traits in cyanobacteria, a phylogenomics perspective. So Professor Tal, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good. Yeah. Great. So first of all, I would like to thank Tzachi for the kind invitation to come here, and of course to his team that helped to arrange everything that has to do with the travel. Sorry for all of the delayed emails, by the way. And when I saw the title of the conference, I was a bit clueless as to what should I talk about. I do have a couple of publications on language evolution, but I'm not a linguist. So I decided to focus today on molecular phylogenetics, as this is the tool we all use when we would like to reconstruct evolution of genes, of species. And in the literature, you also see these methods for reconstruction, the evolution of languages. And so just to maybe shortly introduce you to the field of molecular phylogenetics. Now this is on. Yes, now it works, sorry. I wanted to start with this paper, which is a seminal paper in the field of molecular phylogenetics by Zuckerkan and Pauling. They suggested in, this is the years 1965, that they were inspired by what you can read in literature and reconstruct the evolution of documents. And they suggested that we can also treat genomes and genes as documents of evolutionary history. And they suggest that different types of molecules are discussed in this paper with regard to their fitness for providing the basis for molecular phylogeny. And they suggest that we can calculate distances between genes and organisms based on the information in these molecules. And indeed, 2 years later, Fitch and Margolies published this paper where they suggested a way how we can actually do it. So we can see here on the right the famous tree, one of them by Charles Darwin, published about 100 years before that other paper. And here on the left, we see the basically first phylogenetic tree reconstructed from genes, in this case cytochrome C in eukaryotes. And you see here the main elements that we know today in phylogenetic trees. It has a root, this is a common ancestor. It has branches leading to species that we know today. And we have here bifurcating branches showing us ancestral nodes or ancestral species that are reconstructed to have occurred sometime in evolution. Now, the methods we use today to reconstruct phylogenetic trees, they all reconstruct this kind of a tree, which is unrooted. So it has all of the elements of the relatedness between the organisms or genes, only that it doesn't have the root, the ancestor. And if we want to know who is the root, who is the ancestor, which will also give us a direction for this tree from early to late, we have to use additional methods, and they can root such unrooted trees, for example, on this point in here, and then this is the topology we will have. B diverged first from the root, and C and D are nearest neighbors. And this specific unrooted tree can be rooted in all possible internal and external branches, yielding to variable topologies of the relations between the ancestors, so who is the ancestor, and who would be the nearest neighbors later on during evolution. So how do we do it today? There are a couple of quite old methods to root phylogenetic trees. If you picture a tree in that way, we can, for example, use the outgroup method. If we find another group that we know is for sure external to the group of organisms we are interested in, we can add it to the tree, and then the point where it binds a branch in this tree is just pulled down in order to create the root. Another method that doesn't need or requires any external information is the midpoint rooting, in which we can follow the longest path along the branches in this tree, thinking that they might show us the deepest time in evolutionary history, and then we just pull this longest path in the middle to create the root and the ancestor in this tree. A couple of years ago, we published a new method to root phylogenetic trees. We call it the ancestor deviation, or the minimal ancestor deviation method to root phylogenetic trees. The conceptual idea behind this method is that we can quantify the distance of each point on the branches of this tree from the root of the tree. So this is an example phylogenetic tree for one gene in metazoa and fungi, and the branches here are painted by the distance from the root. So if you find the minimum distance on the branches, that would be in here. This is going to be the root according to this approach. And what I want to show you today is how we can also use this measure, the new measure for distance from the root, the ancestral deviation, in order to test statistical support in various phylogenetic hypotheses. And this is when where I want to introduce you to the main players in the story today, cyanobacteria. They are not only beautiful, they also invented photosynthesis, and by that process they transformed the Earth's atmosphere into oxygenic atmosphere that we breathe today. They are the ancestors of all photosynthetic eukaryotes. They are the ancestors of plastids. And in addition, they represent a prime example of prokaryotic multicellularity. One of the hallmarks of the multicellularity traits in cyanobacteria are special cells called heterocysts that are differentiated from vegetative cells, and they supply a micro anaerobic environment for an enzyme that is used by cyanobacteria to fix nitrogen. The enzyme is oxygen sensitive, hence it is not very efficient if it tries to function where photosynthesis is being performed. And in these very special cells, they kind of block oxygen from entering the cell, and the nitrogenase can function here very efficiently. Now, these cells, because they do not perform photosynthesis, might require still fixed carbon. This is what happens in photosynthesis. And they can receive fixed carbon from neighbor cells and also share their fixed nitrogen with the cells that perform photosynthesis. So this is a prime example of cell differentiation in cyanobacteria, as well as division of labor between different types of cells. Notably, heterocysts cannot reproduce. They cannot divide anymore. Once they differentiate into heterocysts, there is no cell division. Hence, they are also a prime example for an emergent trait of a multicellular organism. So the fitness of heterocysts is 0 because they cannot reproduce. Hence, they only contribute to the whole filament in this sense. So now I presented to you what happens in cyanobacteria that have heterocysts. As I said, they can fix nitrogen and photosynthesize in the same time, and that makes the nitrogenase activity very efficient. What do other cyanobacteria that fix nitrogen do and do not have heterocysts? We can have examples like Trichodesmium, where we have a physiological separation between nitrogen fixation and photosynthesis. That means specific cells in the filament switch between the different activities. Or we can have temporal solutions, like in cyanotisi, where depending on the time of the day, they can either photosynthesize during the day or fix nitrogen during the night. And this has led to the hypothesis that this trade-off between nitrogen fixation and photosynthesis might have been a prime driver of the evolution of multicellularity in cyanobacteria. To test this hypothesis, we aimed to reconstruct the main events in the evolution of multicellularity in cyanobacteria. So how do we do that? Commonly in the field, what you would do, first of all, you collect traits that you could maybe then assign to different species. And this work was done here by Dr. Katrin Hammerschmidt. She collected 25 different traits of cyanobacteria. Of them, we have here, these are the multicellularity traits. Some of them are phenotypic traits. The other one are specific cell differentiation. We have here some also internal controls. For example, if you are free-living or not free-living, or if you are filamentous or not filamentous, or fixed nitrogen or do not fix nitrogen. The others are ecological adaptations, phenotypic traits, as well as specific habitat adaptations, such as freshwater and marine. And then together with Fernando and Gidi, for my group, we set the challenge to sort these traits according to the order of their emergence in cyanobacteria evolution. What you would do usually next in our field, you would reconstruct a species tree for this group, and then project the traits. In this example, only two traits, unicellular and filamentous, that we show here with blue and yellow or mustard. And this is a species tree that we reconstructed from 17 universal single gene copies in all of the species we had in this set, about 200 of those. Now, I would like to share with you probably the best kept secret in molecular phylogenetics, which is, if we now look at the gene trees that we have represented here as a single tree, each one of them creates a slightly different phylogenetic signal from one another. So each gene tree actually tells a slightly different evolutionary history, which is not always corresponding to what the other genes say. And there is a specific tool called NeighborNet that you can also present graphically this conflicting information or multiple signal. And in this plot on the right, I show you here all of the possible splits that you can see in these 17 genes. And you can see some of them actually put in question some of the properties that we see here on the left in this tree. So the moral of the story here is, if you look for a tree, you will find one. But if you look at the data, you will find many. And why is that? This is because of how bacteria evolve. We have genetic recombination, we have lateral gene transfer, and above all, in addition, we have also methodological artifacts that are inherent to how we compare sequences by multiple sequence alignment or reconstruct the trees using tree reconstruction algorithms. So in phylogenomics, what we aim to do is to reconstruct evolutionary events using many trees, not only 1 or 17, preferably a whole genome. All of the genes in a genome can be used to reconstruct trees and summarized into one result. So the method we developed here is a method to test phylogenetic hypothesis using the ancestral deviation. How does it work, more or less? We have here a large data set of about 200 species and about 1,600 gene families. And then each gene family produces one tree, right, that we can calculate, infer, and calculate with the ancestral deviations, which you can see here as a gradient of color on the branches. We then take each pair of traits from our 25 traits, and we project them on the phylogenetic tree. Now, when we root our phylogenetic trees, this induces trait polarity because it induces a direction from ancestors to descendants in the phylogenetic tree. Right? So if we compare two traits, they can either emerge simultaneously in this phylogenetic tree, or one trait can be earlier than another one. In this case, the yellow is earlier than the green one. Or in the other case, the green trait may emerge earlier than the yellow trait, or it can be also undecided, if we cannot tell. Now, if we collect the ancestor deviation estimates from our method, we can compare the support in the different scenarios for these traits. Right? Because we know that the minimum ancestor deviation is the place where we infer the root, which is the significant place where we should reconstruct our ancestor to descendant topology. So using this approach, we can calculate a statistical support for specific pairs of traits. For example, one result from this analysis is that in cyanobacteria evolution, unicellular cyanobacteria preceded the evolution of filamentous ones. And because we are dealing here with many protein families, meaning many trees, we can calculate the support in this conclusion. Right, so as I told you, we had not only 2 traits, we had 25 traits. So that means that we we performed such pairwise tests for 25 to the 2 pairs using our data set, which includes about 200 species and about 1,600 phylogenetic trees. We then sorted all of the resulting conclusions according to this network that shows us now the evolution of traits, the order of trait evolution in cyanobacteria from the past in here to the present here. So what are the main stages? We have here at the beginning the ancestor of cyanobacteria. The next phase or next era in cyanobacteria evolution is the transition to multicellular individuality. This was followed by the expansion of niche occupation and interaction with other species, and finally the evolution of higher complexity. Now let's go back and do it now a bit slower. So as I said, on the left we have all of the traits that are likely describe the ancestor of cyanobacteria. The important traits here are unicellular, so it was unicellular organism. It did not fix nitrogen, or at least did not have yet the genes to fix nitrogen. It was most likely a free-living organism that was planktonic. Notably here, we cannot really decide whether this organism originated in freshwater or a marine environment. This is where we cannot have a clear answer for our hypothesis or precedence hypothesis. The next era is the transition to multicellular individuality. We have here a clear transition with the expansion in metabolic capacity by nitrogen fixation. So we infer here that the evolution of nitrogen fixation occurred quite early in cyanobacteria, and that led to the incompatibility between nitrogen fixation and photosynthesis. This was followed by temporal or physiological solutions, as I presented before. And in addition, the evolution of a reproductive life cycle with the evolution of 2 morphological traits, filamentous and homogonia, which are motile filaments that cyanobacteria or filamentous cyanobacteria can produce. The next era is marked by the expansion of niche occupation and interaction with other species. We see here epiphytic and periphytic cyanobacteria that can live in or on other organisms, microbial mats, so that's again related to how cyanobacteria reside in specific habitats, as well as the evolution of thermophilic cyanobacteria that can sustain living in very high temperatures. The last era is marked by evolution of cell differentiation, with the prime example of heterocysts, the special cells that where nitrogen fixation occurs, as well as akinets. These are, let's say, analogs to spores, bacteria cells that can survive desiccation and afterwards switch again to the vegetative formation. We have here also evolution of cell division in multiple planes of the cell, which was probably, according to our inference, then was later in comparison to the filamentous cyanobacteria. So we see the evolution of higher complexity in cyanobacteria. Our next question was then, if we look at a complex cell, such as the heterocyst, right, it is complex with regards to function, where how nitrogen fixation occurs in a microanaerobic environment, as well as the differentiation of heterocyst itself. We would ask then, how old are the genes that are involved in heterocyst function and differentiation, with the two competing hypotheses, either for this new type of cells, all of the genes evolved somewhere in this era of cyanobacteria, or maybe some genes are old, they existed already in ancestor, and we might observe diversification of genes or the evolution of new genes with the evolution of this phylum. So to answer that question, Katrin again set forth to study the literature, and she assembled a set of 90 genes that are known to be involved in heterocyst function and differentiation. And together with PhD student Natasha, they plotted the distribution of these gene families over different cyanobacteria that are characterized by the different traits. Either they are unicellular, or they are filamentous, or cyanobacteria that can differentiate heterocysts. Once we project this presence-absence pattern of the genes on the phylogenetic tree, this already gives us an idea if the genes evolved already in the ancestor of cyanobacteria, if they are present in all cyanobacteria in here, or if they are present in filamentous cyanobacteria as well as heterocyst-forming cyanobacteria in here, or only in heterocyst-forming cyanobacteria. Again, but gene presence-absence is not enough. As we said, phylogenetic trees may have different topologies depending, for example, where was the first ancestor of the gene, or in addition, lateral gene transfer. So in addition, we also reconstructed phylogenetic trees and also the rooted topologies using our MED approach. And now this presence-absence pattern is presented not only in one color that says if the gene is present or not in the organism. Rather, we also show on which side of the root are you, right? So if we have the phylogenetic tree, we can ask which genes or which organism for this specific gene are present on the right side of the root, that means the heterocyst-forming cyanobacteria, or the left side of the root, that would be in this case unicellular cyanobacteria. And that enables us to reconstruct the origin of those 90 gene families, either to the ancestor of all cyanobacteria, the ancestor of filamentous cyanobacteria, or the ancestor of heterocyst-forming cyanobacteria. When we summarize our results, we found that out of the 90 genes, or gene families that we studied, about half of them originated already at the ancestor of cyanobacteria, and the rooted topology of their phylogenetic trees clearly suggested that they have no unusual lateral gene transfer events. They really originated here, and the topology looked like the ancestors of the unicellular as well as filamentous cyanobacteria. The genes include, for example, genes that are involved in nitrogen fixation, as well as the regulation of nitrogen fixation, depending on environmental and cellular cues. Another about 40 genes were reconstructed to the ancestor of filamentous cyanobacteria in here, and the most common function there was cell-cell communication, or communication between cells. This suggests that the basis for communication between cells preceded the evolution of the division of labor between heterocyst and vegetative cells in a filament. Only 6 genes gave us the signal that they evolved at the ancestor of heterocyst-forming cyanobacteria in here, and these 6 genes, almost all of them appear as master regulators of heterocyst differentiation. Right, so to conclude that, most of the genes required for heterosis function and differentiation are very ancient. Okay, so to summarize all of that, our work showed that the trade-off between nitrogen fixation and photosynthesis was likely a major driver of the transition to multicellularity in cyanobacteria. Most of the genes required for heterosis function and differentiation are ancient, and we know this kind of idea, or it follows the idea of Richard Dawkins on the blind watchmaker. We see here an example for the evolution of highly complex system based on genes that were already present. So how did it work? We think that this transition and the evolution of heterosis differentiation and other differentiated cells probably was via evolution of regulatory elements of existing genes, which then evolved by temporal switches or into having temporal or physiological switches, likely via phenotypic heterogeneity or plasticity. Once established, multicellular individuality opened new vistas of opportunities for the evolution of this interesting phylum, the cyanobacteria. Right, so with that I would like to acknowledge the people at work. On the left, my group, and on the right, the scientists whose work I presented today. And yeah, with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Tal, for the excellent talk.
Thanks.
So we open to questions. Anybody? Any questions? Oh, Asaf? Could you please then speak out loud? I don't know if we have a microphone. Do we have a microphone?
Maybe your microphone.
I do have a microphone. I can throw it at you. I will give you the microphone. No, because this is being live streamed. So we were requested that that you would have a microphone so they become clear. Okay, so I'll give you this one. Which one? Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. Two important traits in cyanobacteria that might influence here that I'm curious whether you consider them. One is a viral infection, of course, and whether there's a difference in defense system between single-celled cyano and multicellular cyano. We know very little about filamentous viruses and a lot about the infection of single-celled cyano. That's one. And the second trait is toxicity, toxin biosynthesis, which is also shared in many cyano, and whether these somehow act to shape this phylogenetic tree in terms of toxicity.
Yeah, thank you. So we didn't look at these two traits. What I could think, for example, for the viral infections, it is for sure very interesting to understand what happens once a virus infects a filamentous rather than unicellular cyanobacteria, and how the possibility of cells to communicate much more fast than unicellular bacteria in a population might affect the infection development. For toxicity, also we didn't look at that. I would bet or think that it might fall in here, right, for the expansion of niche occupation and interaction with other species. Yeah, thank you for these ideas.
Yes, please.
I understand the functional basis of multicellularity, but what about the mechanics? It's not just sharing functions and increasing the efficiency, but you also have to like stick cells together. You have to give birth to proteins or like borrow them from somewhere and induce the interaction between the cells, and that has to be selected too. There has to be some selection pressure on the binding of cells, not just sharing function.
Definitely. One interesting trait of the cyanobacteria multicellularity is also the patterned multicellularity that goes also with physical properties of the filament. For example, in Adabaena, these are the linear filaments. Heterocysts are differentiated only every 10 cells, and that produces a lot of interesting questions about how the division of labor is formed. We recently found one small operon of 2 proteins that might explain some of that. It seems that when you knock out this small operon, cyanobacteria filaments go out of alignment and they look like a zigzag. Right? So I assume that there are other proteins that are indeed adding to the pattern multicellularity, how the filaments look like, how the filaments behaves under tension, that are yet to be discovered. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I can shout. So you showed us with some detail the story of cyanobacteria as it evolves towards higher complex structures. My question is, how universal is this trend? Namely, if you were to follow a similar transition in other totally unrelated species that also evolved higher multicellular organizations, are we seeing here something that is unique to cyanobacteria, or perhaps this is a recipe that may have been applied more generally?
Yeah. So evidence from analogous studies looking at the genetic basis of multicellular organisms that is accumulating in the literature in the last few years. And this suggests that in many cases, again, following the ideas by Richard Dawkins, such complex systems do not evolve over one day. Rather, the basis or the genes are present in different forms or different functionalities in these organisms, and are then slowly recruited to build higher complexity with time. That actually, I think, shifts a bit the focus from the evolution of genes de novo, right, evolution of new genes, to probably focusing more on gene regulation, on the regulation of gene transcription or expression, and how phenotypic plasticity of the organism, that means different phenotypes that might be expressed under different conditions, might contribute to the evolution of the organism as a whole. Again, echoing all the ideas by Waden on phenotypic plasticity first, right? How first phenotypic plasticity can exist as depending on the environmental conditions, and then can be fixed depending on the evolutionary scenarios of the organism.
Okay. So if you would like to do talk with Tal, we have to end here this discussion. If you would like to continue, please do it afterwards. Thank you very much, Tal. So we will continue for our second speaker. So we're talking about, Tal was talking about genome, phylogenomics, trees from cyanobacteria. Now we're going to move to Professor Eske, also in the field of genomics. So Professor Eske holds a Prince Philip Professorship in Ecology and Evolution at the University of Cambridge, and a Lundbeck Foundation Professorship in Evolution at Copenhagen University. He is also the director of the Center of Excellence in Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen. Professor Eske is one of the early pioneers of the study of ancient DNA, and they explore, probably is not able within this time frame to explain, but he has extracted DNA from megafauna to hominids, and this is one of the very interesting contributions that allow us to reconstruct the past and give us a window to the past and enrich our understanding of biological evolution. So his talk is about what DNA can tell us on spread of humans and languages. So Professor Eske, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm just trying to find my talk here. Okay, just one moment here. Yeah. Okay, so I'm a population geneticist, and normally what we're working with is trying to understand how we as modern human obtained our contemporary genetic diversity through migration, through selection, and so forth. But occasionally, we are also working with linguists in trying to use this population genetic data to say something about, do we find support for one linguistic model over another in terms of spread and origins of languages? So I guess we're using it in two different ways. One is to say, okay, there's different types of models explaining, the origins and spread of a certain language. And we say, okay, do the genetics tell us anything about, is one more likely than another? And another situation is where you can say you have a very good understanding on the spread of the language. And then you say we can use the genetic data to say something about what was the process by which this language was spread, okay? So those are the two different ways you can say we are operating in this context. And I want to give you some examples on both. So we got involved in all this when we did a study on Bronze Age Europe and Asia. And the Bronze Age starts around 5,000 years ago. And there had been a long discussion in archaeology, whether this transition in lifestyle during the Bronze Age was due to, the same people basically learning to do something new, or whether it was due to a migration of people into Europe and into Asia. And we found very strong support for the later. So we saw genetically, when we look at these ancient Bronze Age skeletons and obtain the genomes, that there's evidence of, you can say, human migration going from the Pontic steppe here in Eastern Europe and Western Asia into Western Europe around 5,000 years ago, and at the same time, a migration of people going from the Pontic steppe eastwards into Western and Central Asia. And this was very exciting when you are a linguist, apparently, because it digs into this idea of the early spread of the Indo-European languages. So the Indo-European languages it's the most, you can say, widely spoken language family today. It's all over the world, and obviously linguists have been interested to understand from where is it coming, when did it originate, how did it spread. And there's a number of different theories and models out there, varying in terms of time of origin and time of spread. And this pattern we saw, from the Pontic steppe going northwest and eastward with a migration fits presumably very beautifully with one of these models. Some people refer it to the steppe hypothesis, that you can say way before genetics had actually predicted that this is exactly the type of pattern you should see. And I think for Europe, you can say it makes kind of sense. Obviously, we can never say, or we can't at least say at this stage, what these people were speaking. But what we can see is that these Bronze Age individuals from the Pontic steppe had massive genetic impact on the European population. I mean, so here we have the gray dots are representing contemporary genetic diversity in Europe. And, from the earlier periods, the hunter-gatherers and the farmers are kind of falling outside contemporary genetic diversity in Europe. But when we get to the Bronze Age, 5,000 years ago, this is really where you can say the diversity that we see today start getting formed. So that makes sense. I think that, these Yamnaya people really was, delivering not only genetic signatures, but also potentially the Indo-European languages to Europe. What about Asia? Because we also find these Yamnaya individuals, as I said, as predicted by the steppe hypothesis, we find those individuals in Western Asia as well. But opposite Europe, we see that there's basically almost no genetic impact of the Yamnayas on the local population that was living there when the Yamnaya enters. So this local population, no one knew anything about who they were genetically, who are they related to, or anything like that. And when we sequenced them, to our great surprise, we could see they actually represents a group of people that we had found earlier, but in the early Stone Age, around 24,000 years ago, and that we know now are partly ancestral to Native Americans. And we thought they were all died out in the Upper Stone Age, but in fact, in Western and Central Asia, these guys seems to survive until around 5,000 years ago. Maybe a little bit later than that. And these peoples, here it's represented by the Botai site, are also, we found out, the earliest that we know of that domesticated the horse. So it's, you can say, a hunter-gatherer group that actually did something pretty amazing in human history. They were hunting horses, eating them, and then at some point they captured some, start milking them and riding them. And the horse domestication is probably one, if not the most important event in human history in terms of changing our life. It trades how we trade, how we make warfare, the distances we can cover, etc. The tragic irony for these guys is that they manage doing this, but they don't manage to kind of commercialize it. So, they kind of die out without giving this knowledge to anybody else. And the one we call the Przewalski horse today, which is the last so-called free wild horse, if you want, is actually the Botai horse that kind of got reintroduced into the wild, if you want. But maybe that's the reason. Anyways, what we can see is that these peoples, even though Yamnaya is getting in there, they don't mix with Yamnaya. They don't have anything to do with them. And then Yamnaya, opposite Europe, really have very limited cultural or genetic impact in Asia. So it doesn't really fit that well with the steppe hypothesis when you go into Western Asia and Central Asia. Another place where the spread of the Indo-European languages doesn't fit very well with the steppe hypothesis is in Anatolia, where we have the Hittites. So Hittites is, you can say, the earliest written evidence of the Indo-European languages and one of the earliest branches of Indo-European language. And according to the steppe hypothesis, you would assume, the Indo-European languages are delivered to the Hittites from these Yamnaya-like people, right? But when you sequence some of these Hittites, so far at least, we have I can't remember how many it was, maybe 20 or something, that has been at least identified to be likely Hittites in Anatolia, we see absolutely no evidence of Indo-European genetic signatures in them. So either, the language, Indo-European language was transferred by some kind of cultural event that didn't involve any sexual interaction, if you want, between the peoples, or there's something wrong with the steppe hypothesis, right, in that regard. The same goes if we go to India. Okay, now you can't really see this, but this is India going around here. And, it has been a bit of a mystery because in northern India and in Pakistan, you find peoples that are speaking Indo-Iranian. Versions of Indo-Iranian, which is Indo-European languages, and it's kind of there has been a debate of how did it get there. And some have argued it's these Yamnaya people who spread all the way, eastwards from the Pontic steppe and southward into northern India and Pakistan. But in fact, yes, when you look at the genetic signatures, you can say steppe signatures, genetic signatures in these Indian, northern Indian and Pakistani populations, but you also see other genetic signatures. So you see also, you are also seeing an Iranian Neolithic signature. You are actually seeing also a genetic signature from something Neolithic, it means early farmers from Europe. So there's no doubt that the Yamnaya cannot explain by themselves, you can say, the genetics as being the one that delivered the Indo-European languages to northern India and Pakistan. In fact, when we started sequencing individuals from there, we saw a much more parsimonious explanation for these genetic signatures, is that the Indo-Iranian signature, a Neolithic signature, as well as the steppe signature, we can find in an earlier Copper Age culture just north of India that are not Indo-European speakers. Okay, so that actually suggests that maybe the majority of this, what you call European-like or West Eurasian-like genetic signatures, has come independently of the Indo-European languages. Okay, so what we do believe is that the ones that probably deliver this, and that also takes out these Botai people, poor Botai people who have managed domesticating the horse, but really didn't make much out of it, is a later Bronze Age expansion coming out of the Urals and northwestern Europe. They have different names in different places, but many call them Centasta. They are coming after Yamnaya, and they have invented, you can say, the chariot. It's the first ones inventing that, and it's a very efficient war machine. And those are different genetically from Yamnaya because they are already mixtures between the Yamnaya steppe people and the Neolithic farmers in Europe. So they have this European genetic Neolithic signature in them that we also see in India and Pakistan. Okay, so most likely, I would say the most parsimonious explanation at the moment, at least, is that these are the guys who are basically delivering the Indo-European languages to India and Pakistan, while the majority of the genetic signature, not all of it, but the majority is actually coming from somebody who is not Indo-European speakers. So if we then move forward in time into, you can say, the Iron Age and onwards, everything in Europe and Asia is something related to the Silk Route. Because now we have the horse, and the people who are controlling the Silk Route are actually the ones who are kind of, on top of everything in society. And so there we have, after the Centasta, that have been dominating this area, we have the so-called Scythians, and the Scythians we can see genetically are a mixture between, the descendants of Centasta and people coming down from the Siberian forests and occupying this steppe area. So it's a very multi-ethnic group, but have a very similar culture. And they are still believed to be, now we're into a period where there's written evidence, they're still believed to be Indo-Iranian speakers, speakers of Indo-European languages. But this is changing with the next wave of people coming in, which is the Huns. And we know that the Huns are the ones that are contributing the Turkic language into Western Asia, Eastern Europe, and so forth. So there is, according to my linguistic colleagues at least, there's pretty good evidence what's going on linguistically. But there wasn't a very good understanding of how did it happen. And there we can see the Huns, when you look at them genetically, we can see they're coming out of China, basically, of something called the Xiongnu Confederation in China. And they're spreading across, but they actually leave very limited genetic signatures behind. So they have this massive impact linguistically, changing the whole steppe area from being Indo-Iranian to being Turkic-speaking, but with very limited genetic impact. So maybe, most likely, it's kind of, one of these ruler societies, upper-class societies, where they have a massive cultural impact, but very little genetic impact. The next ones occupying the steppe is the Mongols. Right? Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde, and all that. And there we see the opposite, really. There we see that there's a massive, massive genetic impact. They are the ones transforming the whole Western Asia from being genetically, if you want, European or Western Eurasian, as we call them, alike, into becoming East Asians alike. But in terms of linguistically, it's a very limited impact compared to the Huns. That actually was just the opposite. Massive linguistic impact, but limited genetic impact. So it doesn't have to go hand in hand. Another example that we have been trying to deal with is peopling of the Americas. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of time, so it's going to be kind of very brief. But in terms of the Americas, when I talk to linguists, they say that the diversity of languages in the Americas is so huge that either there must have been a very, very early entrance of people, or there must have been multiple migrations of peoples from elsewhere into the Americas. And I would say none of those two versions are currently fitting neither the archaeological data or the genetic data. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying we have an issue here. But nevertheless, I mean, it's generally believed that linguistically you can distinguish among Native Americans between two different groups, the Amerindians, which are these very early and very diverse languages, and then you have a later entrance, they are believed, of the Athabascan speakers. And the Athabascans you find up here today mainly in the most northern part of North America. There's a few going south, but that's much later event. Genetically, you can say we find evidence of some kind of evidence supporting such a scenario, at least. So all the old skeletons we have sequenced so far from the Americas, first of all, genetically, they are Native Americans. They're closer to Native Americans than they are to anybody else. So, as I will show a little bit later, Native Americans are genetically formed approximately 23,000 years ago. So it means if there has been something earlier, well, we haven't seen that so far in the old skeletons. There might be indication that there might be something going on there, or possibly, but nevertheless, they are Native Americans. However, we do see a very deep divergence within Native Americans happening between 14 and 60,000 years ago, which roughly resembles, you can say, the Athabascans on one hand and the Amerindians on the other hand. And the Athabascans are characterized by carrying an extra East Asian signature that you don't find in the Amerindians, okay? Suggesting that something came in later that potentially could have carried with them the Athabascan language. The other group, of course, that we see beside those two possible migrations into the Americas are Paleo-Eskimos and Inuits, but those are way later events. I mean, there we are talking Paleo-Eskimos probably around 6,000 years ago. Inuits, it's a couple of thousand years ago. So it's quite late events and have a different linguistic, you can say, story attached to them. We also can see genetically that the oldest branch of Native Americans we find in Alaska. It's an extinct branch. We don't see it today. We haven't identified in any living Native Americans. It diversifies from other Native Americans around 21,000 years ago. But it is in Alaska. And that, of course, supports the idea that people came through that route, right? But it also tells us something differently. It tells us that this area where we find this very early branch of Native Americans, we call them ancient Berindians, is today occupied by Athabascans. Okay, so they have basically replaced these early peoples, and the last of those so far we see 9,000 years ago. So it means, and they don't have that extra Asian signature that you see in Athabascans. So that kind of implies that most likely this extra Asian signature getting into Athabascans came sometimes after 9,000 years, possibly bringing with it the Athabascan language. So that goes into, you can say, where are they coming from and where are Native Americans coming from? So we have looked at a number of ancient samples in Siberia You can say what it suggests is that Native Americans are really formed, as I said, around 23,000 years ago, genetically speaking, by the meetings of two peoples. One which is related to these first horse domesticating guys, and the other one is a very basal branch related to East Asian people. They're meeting up, mixing up, becoming Native Americans, and probably very soon after entering into the Americas. But we also found another individual dated, an ancient individual dated to around 11,000 years ago, which represents the closest you can get, so to this date at least, for this extra Asian signature you find in Athabascans. Okay? And what is interesting there is there has been linguists that have been arguing, okay, now this map is not very good, but that have been arguing that there is a linguistic link between the Athabascans and a group of Siberians all over here in Western Siberia, very far away from the Bering Strait, called the Kets, right? So some have argued, well, it is actually some kind of Proto-Athabascan they're speaking. It's been quite controversial, but more and more people have been kind of buying into this idea. But when you look at the Kets today, well, they look like Siberians. They're not closely related to Athabascans in North America. However, when you actually look at this ancient individual 11,000 years ago, which resembles, you can say, the closest we have to date for that extra Asian signature in Athabascans, you find that this signature is way higher in the Kets than it is in any other of the Siberian groups. So therefore, one possibility, right, by using this genetics and linguistic theory is to say, well, maybe what it do suggest is that this is just the remnants, really, of a much larger meta-population that was speaking some kind of Athabascan-like language, and that was then fragmented up, right? And you have the Kets remaining, being pretty heavily admixed later on, but, you know, are keeping some of that. So that's another way to use this kind of stuff. Then I'll just, I don't know how much time I have. Oh shit, okay, this is really bad. Okay, well, just to say, we also find the signature in Brazil, which is really odd, that carries, you know, something related to Andaman Islanders, which is this group of islands, you know, down in between India and Thailand, so very far away, that you find in Brazilians, also ancient Brazilian skeletons, 12,000 years old, but we don't find it outside Brazil. It's only a very tiny 2 to 6%. So it could indicate that maybe there has been something way older in the Americas, but we don't have the answer to that question at the moment. Okay, I just wanted to, if I have time, to finish off with Australia, because Australia is also a weird thing in terms of linguistics, in the sense that, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm not a linguist, but you know, some 90% of Aboriginal Australians are speaking the Papua-Nunian language family, that most linguists believe is maybe something like 4,000 to 6,000 years old. On the other hand, our genetic studies, as well as archaeology, suggest that Australia was occupied for the last 50, 60,000 years. Okay, so how can you explain this? And when we look at the population genetics, basically this area has been isolated until just maybe 2,000 years ago. Totally isolated. There's been a little bit of contact with Papua, but that's it. You know, otherwise they've been living in their own world since, so to speak, they occupied the place. And we can see they're part of this migration of people very early, diversifying very early compared to European and Asians. Also, you can say in the process of migration, generating people like the Andaman Islanders, which is these guys that also we see the signature in Native Americans and so forth. Anyways, what is weird is when you look at the genetic trees over, you know, the different branches of these Papua-Nunian languages, right? It actually fits very beautifully with the linguistic trees. The only difference is that the date of the origin. One is like 50,000 for the genetics, and the linguistics is only 4,000 to 6,000. So either there's something completely wrong in one of these two ways of calculating times of origins, but another possible explanation, and this is, I promise you, it's the final, is that we actually do see around 4,000 to 6,000 years ago a population increase in northeastern Australia, where many people believe that the Papua New Guinean language family originates from. And then, it's spreading, tiny spreads of peoples across the continent. So therefore, it could actually be that is the process. But in that case, we are talking about, a very few humans having a massive impact on, you can say, the ones that were, it's almost like two men appears and say, now you should talk this language, right? It's pretty hard to see how this is happening, but I mean, it's the best explanation we have at the moment anyways. Thank you, and sorry for that I'm running out of time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So time for 2 questions, because there's a lot of food for the thought here. Any questions? Okay, one question there. We have a second microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating. This works. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have any idea about when there is a link between the genetic diversity and the linguistic diversity, and when there isn't.
When there is.
Why?
Yeah, and why?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I don't. I think. Yeah. To be honest, I can't at the moment, at least. It's of course limited what information we have, but I don't think there's any kind of rule. I can't see any rule at the moment, right? I gave examples of situations where you can say there's very limited genetic impact, presumably massive linguistic influence, right? And also the opposite. So it's pretty hard, but I think if we get more data, maybe we can, if we incorporate, social structure as well, maybe then we can find some kind of pattern. If you have like this, as I said, this kind of overrule system, maybe that's where you don't need much genetics, but can have massive cultural and so forth. But the data at the moment is too limited, I'm afraid, yeah.
Another question?
There's one over there, I think, yeah.
We just have one more, and then you can continue after lunch.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
During lunch.
Okay.
So, on the right.
So you mentioned that the Huns would have spread the Turkic languages, but as far as we know, the Huns spoke an Indo-European language. In fact, the only 3 words we know in Hunnic, which is Medos, Strava, and Kamos, are all very clearly Indo-European.
I didn't say the Han did it, though. That's not what I meant anyways. What I meant was that genetically what you can see is that that the Huns are genetically very closely related to this Xiongnu Confederation in China. But it's not, I don't, now I'm also on really deep water here already, so I don't think that it's necessarily that the Xiongnu was speaking Han. It's just that Xiongnu is part of, you can say, it's part of China.
We don't know anything about the Xiongnu other
than
what the Chinese wrote about.
No. But so I'm not saying it's Han. It's not like necessarily, Han Chinese, if you want.
Oh no, Huns is in the Hunnic people who.
Oh, the Huns. Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay. Okay. Anyways, that's what I've been told by my linguistic colleagues. Maybe I don't want to argue. If you know something different, it's not my area. They said it's very clear that this is believed to be the case, that they were Turkic speaking. But you question that, or?
Yeah, I'd question that.
Okay. Well, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Al and Eske. I'll see you after lunch.